do you think measuring wellbeing is so important if we're going to improve wellbeing in workplaces? Isn't that just for academics?
Perhaps.
Do we have to bother?
Perhaps it is, but so I've been working in the measurement space around well-being since about 2011, 2012, which was actually my first visit to Australia. Didn't know it would lead to me living here for more than 4 years now. But you know, yes, we use measurement in academia, but I think there are some very real and important reasons why we do indeed want to be measuring well-being, but we also want to be thoughtful about what we're doing and why we're doing it as well. First thing, in terms of measurement, is measurement impacts what we do. Think about the markers that we typically use in the workplace. What are your markers of success? We often measure things like profit. We think about things like sick days in terms of employee engagement and whatnot. Those things that we measure are the things that we actually manage. And so they impact how people perform as employees, how managers lead. And so what we measure impacts what we do. So when you measure well-being, it says the message that we actually care about the well-being of our employees. And so we're actually taking that forward and doing something about that. And now we're going to hold people accountable to that. We're going to hold managers accountable to that. And so it's a statement about what we care about. The second thing that measurement does is it reveals the landscape. It helps us understand what is actually already happening there, where are the strengths, where are the weaknesses. One thing that it's easy to do is okay, we want to care about well-being, so we're going to do a well-being program. That might actually be useful for employees, or it might be something they either know or don't care about. By measuring it can actually give us insights into where we should be focusing and how we should be going about things. Example of this with this survey that you'll be hearing about tonight. About 40% of people are most likely to seek help from people outside of work, and only 8% of people go to HR. If you're in HR, that's actually fascinating to understand, like, well, why are people coming to us or not coming to us? Because that actually impacts behavior. So by knowing where people go, it can give us insights in terms of what we actually want to do. We also saw in the survey that people felt they were actually pretty good at giving encouragement and support to others, but not so much that they were encouraged and supported by others. That actually gives us insights into perhaps what we should be doing. Not just that relationships are important, but what about relationships is important, and what do we need to be doing there? And then when we start to break this down in terms of different departments, different job roles, different industries, how long people have been in the job, things like age, it can give us further insights into how to go about things. And so we can start to come to a more individualized approach to well-being, and not just sort of a one-size-fits-all approach to things. A third thing is that measurement actually tells us what's working and what's not working. We can do a lot in the workplace that we think is a good idea, and sometimes it's a good idea, and sometimes it's not. Sometimes it's actually just a waste of resources, or even could be doing harm. One thing I've noticed as this well-being conversation has come about is people will look at places like Google and they say, well, what does Google do? They have things like ping pong tables and fruit faxes and things like that, so we should bring those in. One thing we see is that in workplaces that are well-functioning, that can be helpful. It says, yeah, management cares about me as an employee. In workplaces that aren't doing well, that actually undermines well-being. It's a sense of they're just trying to get something from me, and it's not actually going to be useful. And so we can actually say, okay, if we're doing things, is it actually useful or not? In our survey, we found that about 40% of workplaces do offer things such as healthy food options, fitness options, and things like getting flu shots and whatnot, which tends to be helpful. But if you don't actually feel you have time to go and take advantage of some of these, then you might not actually be benefiting from it. And so it can come across as, well, yeah, we care about your well-being, But in reality, we don't, because we're not giving you time to actually take advantage of that. A fourth thing is that measurement can tell us a return on investment. At the end of the day, leadership wants to know that if we're spending time and resources on taking care of employee well-being, it's actually because it's making people more productive, we're getting better work, and it has an impact on the bottom line. When we measure things, it starts to say, well, what are we actually doing? Does it actually have an effect or does it not? And then finally, as the researcher here, it does inform the science. There are insights that can come from it, and I think that's more of what we'll unpack tonight.
Yeah, absolutely. So after years of playing with Peggy, the last couple of years particularly, she kind of convinced me that, you know, if we're going to know what's really going on with this wellbeing stuff, we need to get into workplaces and measure it. And one of the challenges I spoke to Marty about when he suggested this idea is that workplaces probably won't measure wellbeing on a large scale. You know, we might include a questionnaire in the engagement survey, but will we really measure our people's wellbeing? And so it has been interesting working alongside Peggy in organisations like Melbourne Water and Vic Roads, where we've had a chance to go in and say, well, if we measure an entire population's wellbeing in a workforce, what does that start to tell us? And the insights we began to get from that were enough to make me start going, oh, okay, there's real value in here. As practitioners, we should definitely be doing more of it. So a couple of weeks ago, we went out into the market after developing a questionnaire based on the PERMA survey that Peggy created, and with the help of Ari, with a couple of extra questions that we added in to understand a bit more of what was going on. And we got an independently collected sample of just over 1,000 people around Australia that were representative of the Australian working population at the moment. So they were from age groups 25 to 65. We were particularly looking at people more in full-time roles. Some of them were working in their own businesses, some of them were working in companies, a real mix across industry, across job level roles, across locations. And when we got that data back, Peggy, we both, I think our jaws dropped a little bit as we started flicking through the numbers going, hang on, there's something going on here that we had a bit of a hunch about, but we had never seen data on wellbeing quite look like this. So can you explain why we've been a little excited the last 10 days as we've been playing like nerds with numbers?
Yes, we have, and just crunching data like crazy, which is, as the nerds, actually is a lot of fun.
This was a Friday night, you know, we're like, let's crunch data.
Exactly, yeah. So this was built upon the original PERMA survey. So we took questions from that and then added things to that. One thing we've been playing with is adding questions on self-determination theory. So thinking about autonomy, relatedness, competence. And we see some interesting things, such as those who are thriving do actually feel a sense of control in terms of decisions they make about how they go about their job. They feel able to do their jobs, and they also relate well together. But the thing that actually really got us excited is a question that we decided to add in there. And as we started playing with the data, it actually brought about a lot of insights. Here's the question. So taking all things together, I mostly felt like I was feeling on top of the world, living well despite some struggles, not feeling terrible, but just getting by and really struggling. You can take a moment and think about where you might be in terms of those 4 categories. Now, think for a moment about well-being, and if any of you have been in this space, how well-being is typically talked about. Now, perhaps you typically think about it like this. This is something we talk about in positive psychology a lot. Traditional psychology is focused on when there are mental illnesses there, we want to move you up to no symptoms. And positive psychology has come along and says, well, yes, that's important, but we also want to think about going from no symptoms to really flourishing and thriving in life. So we think about this in terms of this sort of single continuum, in terms of where you sit along things.
And lots of our audience might be familiar with sort of that -10 to +10 scale.
That's
we've often
exactly
seen sort of positive psychology 101 lectures start with.
That's exactly it. And I think that's what we've really seen as the dominate. When you look at all the different well-being models, that's really the model that we've been looking with. So if we start to look at our sample, we can break that down. And we see that there was about 7% that are really in that languishing, struggling zone. And again, this is a workplace survey, so you don't necessarily want to admit that you might be struggling with mental illness and whatnot, so that's probably pretty right on. About 18% are in that really flourishing and thriving category. And 3/4 of people are in the just sort of functioning and getting by with things.
And we've seen those numbers in other surveys gathered by people, that there's normally this sort of big population sitting in the middle and smaller groups at either end, right?
That's exactly it. And so this is pretty typical when you look at things like Gallup and whatnot, how many people are not exactly engaged in work and whatnot. So this is very typical of what we're seeing. Now, when we go back to that question, again, that gives us 4 categories, not 3. And all of a sudden, this actually starts to look at the data in a very different way. Here's what we see. That other category breaks down so that about 1/3 of people are actually living well despite some struggles. And so when we actually start to break this down, it's no longer just, well, everyone's in the middle, and we actually need to move them up more towards thriving. We can say there are a lot of people that are living well. As we started looking at the other pieces of data that we collected, we started to see something very interesting about this living well despite struggles group that I think provides some interesting insights in terms of what we should and should not be doing in the workplace. So one thing we could be seeing, these are a way to read this. So we have the PERMA across the bottom here, positive emotion, engagement, relationship, meaning, accomplishment, and we have the 4 different groups. The red group is the really struggling, the green group is the thriving, the blue group is the living well despite struggles, and the other one is not feeling bad. They're just sort of getting by in life, so not really happy with life, but not really upset with life either. Now, we see something interesting is that living well group actually looks a lot more like the thriving group than like the struggling group. We see, for instance, that they do have lower levels of positive emotion. They were also lower on physical health as well. But they're actually pretty high in terms of relationships, meaning, and also accomplishment. What we're seeing is these people, yes, they have some struggles, but they're actually doing really well in life. And so I hope you can start to see that if we lump these people together with those that are just getting by, and we start making decisions about how we should be managing people to help their well-being, that this actually starts to change some of the insights we have. That it is actually possible to live well despite struggle, and it's also possible to experience well-being even when, or not really feel that well, even when there are no struggles actually there.
And so you've sort of been talking about this as not one continuum of well-being, but thinking about it as 2, that there's a continuum here of people thriving. How much am I thriving? Not a lot or a whole lot. But there's also a continuum of struggle. How much am I struggling? Not a lot or a whole lot. And this kind of sits to some of the modelling done in the past by Professor Corey Keyes, is that right?
That's exactly it. So Corey Keyes talked about this back in about the time that positive psychology as a field was starting off around 2000. And so he broke down well-being in terms of these 2 continuums in terms of mental illness and mental health. And I think what we're seeing here is that there really is some support in that of actually you can struggle and actually still do well. And it's actually more of a sense of resilience through the challenge as opposed to you can't be struggling and still be doing well.
And when we break this pattern down across self-determination theory, outcomes in workplaces like job satisfaction, how confident and motivated people were to see their well-being, we kept seeing that picture again and again and again, which started to really get you, I think, thinking about, wow, this blue group of people, these people who are living well despite some struggles, are really exhibiting resilience, and that there was in many cases, no statistical significant difference between those people who were living well despite struggles and those people who were thriving at work. Is that right?
That's exactly it. And when I think these groups actually become very interesting to think about is that group that's living well despite struggles actually gives us some real insights into how to help others that are perhaps just getting by, or even those who are struggling, to actually do better. And so I think there are several reasons why it's helpful to kind of break it down into these 4 groups and really break apart that functioning group. The first reason is if we think about that single continuum, that 3/4 of our sample are actually just sort of functioning, that's a very way to think about things than to say, you know what, we have a whole bunch of people that, yeah, they're struggle, but they are doing well. Really, they're living out this idea of resilience. And we want to learn from these people to understand what is it that's actually helping you thrive despite some of the struggles that are actually there. So it gives a real chance to actually learn from these people to understand what helps them do well. And for those that are struggling or just getting by, perhaps those can actually be strategies to help move them further along. Along with that, we also need to think about how to support these people. One thing we see in the literature is that people who are resilient, they are more likely to be resilient in the future, but they're not always resilient. Is that if you are beaten down time and time and time again, at some point you break. It's sort of like the rubber band that if you stretch far enough, even the most stretchiest rubber bands will eventually break. And so we need to think about those who do have those struggles, how can we support them better? They are motivated to take care of their well-being. They understand ways to do that. That's one thing we saw in our data. So the question is, how can we help them and support them so that they can keep on doing that? For the struggling group, I think it actually gives a sense of hope, is that, you know what, if I'm struggling, I can still experience well-being. And so I need to find ways to actually do that. And then for those who are kind of just sort of getting by, those are the ones we want to motivate and get them moving. And that's where, you know, a lot of our positive psychology strategies are actually helpful, such as what we have in our book. And so I think that that's one helpful thing, a part of it. A second thing is that it points to the diversity of well-being. Like it or not, there are a lot of mental health stigmas that exist in the workplace. If I'm struggling, I don't want to actually admit that. We saw that in our data, is that those who were struggling, or those who even were living well, were more likely to go to support outside of the organization as opposed to within.
If they went anywhere, right?
Exactly. And so I think this idea that you can struggle and still do well actually can decrease some of the stigma around mental illness, and actually get support when it's needed. The other thing we saw is across the different groups, they were actually pretty similar in terms of seeing what we call as the 3 Fs. Fruit, fitness, and flu shots, ways that workplaces go out to try to support well-being. There was actually no difference across the groups with this one. And what we see is those who are really thriving, they had those, but then they had more. They had things like well-being coaching. They had other supports, and they actually took advantage of all of those in terms of support. So from our results, we'll actually add on what we're calling the 3 M's. So first of all, it's a sense of meaning, is that those who were thriving felt a real sense of meaning in their workplace, both individually with their teams and with their organization. In terms of self-determination theory, so is filling those at that internal need, that internal motivation, that sense of autonomy, competence, and relatedness. And then I put in mentoring there. We did see that those who were thriving took advantage of things like well-being coaches. Also, they were more likely to go to their bosses, getting that mentoring from others. For those of you who are coaches, that's a good sign for you as well.
In fact, it was a really interesting differentiator, wasn't it? Those who were thriving were much more likely to use a mix of all of those strategies, but one of the big difference they were getting was that well-being coaching, but also they were much more likely to go to their boss or the HR team. They were pretty much the only ones really going to the HR team where they needed support as well. So again, I think really great things for us to learn. The other thing we did, of course, see in that mix was enterprise assistance programs, which of course are popular as part of many workplace wellbeing programs, but we saw it was often people who were struggling more around that rather than the people who were thriving, who were drawing on those EAP services. And I know we're nearly out of time. We're going to borrow a few from the Q&A panel because I think the next bit people will want to see, so I'm going to borrow a few more minutes if that's okay. Jojo's got the hook, she's gone. So Peggy, just lastly, I know one of the other things that you and I have been curious about for a while and starting to see emerge in the data is that while often in workplaces we focus on improving individual wellbeing, that we are social animals, and so teams and organisations also impact our wellbeing. So when we gather this data, just like the PERMA survey, we ask, you know, how are you doing? But how's your team doing and how's your organisation doing? And start to look at, well, what impact is it having from a systems perspective? So do you want to just share some of a little bit of what we found there?
Yeah, just briefly. So this is something we've been trialing, is sort of this idea of not just my individual PERMA, but also the well-being of both my team and how I perceive the organization. And we included that here. And I think there are some very interesting insights that we can start to pull from this. So this is PERMA, so we have it for the individual, the team, and the organization. And on average, we actually see that meaning is actually pretty similar. So they kind of see, I have a sense of meaning, my team does meaningful work, and the organization does meaningful work as well. But some of the other areas start to differ much more. For example, with relationships, people generally felt like, well, you know, I'm good at encouraging and supporting others, but my team is not so well at encouraging and supporting me. My organization especially, they're not so good at that one. We also see, it was more, I'm mostly about my physical health, the organization somewhat, less so the team. And so we can start to say, well...
We think it's all the morning teas with cake, right?
Well, yeah, that might be contributing to a bit. And so we could be thinking about, you know, where is it? And when we start to break this down across different departments, different levels and whatnot, we can say, well, where are people, it's more about them? Where is it the team is really supporting them? Where is the organization serving them well? And where is it not serving them well? Oftentimes with things like meaning and whatnot, that could be actually about communication. People actually are not connecting with the values of the organization, and so that raises an opportunity in terms of how we communicate. And so by taking this more nuanced approach to measurement, which includes both multiple domains of well-being, but also this individual, team, and organization level, I think it can actually help us create more informed approaches to how we actually support the well-being of our employees.
And it kind of goes, Marty's point originally about measuring it was, well, if team leader A knows that team leader B is doing much better on well-being, they'll find all sorts of local ways to start fixing it that we would never think of. And so we actually have a number of organisations at the moment doing just that so that we can see what starts to happen on that data. So Peggy, thank you so much for being with us tonight and sharing those. Can you please give Peggy a round of applause?